Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For this week's true crime narration, I shall be detailing two separate cases of women who ended up on death row for their crimes, Barbara Graham and Karla Faye Tucker. These are two cases that I covered in the early days of my channel, but due to problems with the audio on my early videos, I have updated and re-recorded them. So we begin today by looking at the case of Karla Faye Tucker. She was born in Houston, Texas on the 18th of November 1959. She was the third daughter born to Larry and Carolyn Tucker. Her sisters, Carrie Ann and Kathy Lynn, were 1 and 2 years older than her respectively. Karla and her sisters had an extremely difficult childhood. Their parents had a turbulent marriage, separating many times before finally divorcing in 1969, at which point Karla was 10 years old. Her father, Larry, was given custody of the children but found it difficult to cope with the demands of parenting 3 pre-teen girls. Karla was beginning to struggle in life. She found it hard to communicate with other children in the school and was very self-conscious of the large birthmark on her arm, and with her dark hair always felt less pretty than her blonde-haired, blue-eyed sisters. Larry and Carolyn's divorce proceedings became particularly acrimonious, and it was during this time that Karla found out that Larry was not her biological father. Finding out that she had been conceived during one of her mother's extramarital affairs only further increased her feelings of insecurity and led her to question her position within her family, where, ultimately, she never felt that she belonged. Karla became increasingly rebellious, and in 1973, by the age of 14, she had quit school and fallen into a life of crime. She would often accompany her mother, a rock groupie, on concert tours, and as the years progressed, she grew increasingly dependent on drugs and alcohol. When she was 16, she married a local mechanic by the name of Stephen Griffith. After a short period of happiness, the marriage declined, and they were divorced within 6 years. On Christmas Eve 1979, Karla's mother, Carolyn, died from the effects of many years of drug abuse. Despite their difficulties, Karla relied on her mother and believed that she was the only person who had always truly loved her. Karla's dependence on drugs and alcohol increased, and when Karla was 21, she became friends with a woman by the name of Sean, who introduced her to 35-year-old Danny Garrett. Karla and Danny soon embarked upon a relationship. Karla earned money through sex work, whilst Danny made a living by supplying illegal pills. Meanwhile, Sean and Karla quickly became very close friends, but this friendship was tested when Sean married a man by the name of Jerry Lynn Dean. Sean had met and married Jerry after a short fling, and Karla instantly hated him. On their first meeting, Jerry put his Harley Davidson inside Karla's house for safekeeping. It then leaked oil all over her flooring, and Karla was furious. Every time they met, there was immediate tension. Jerry hated Karla's friendship with his wife, and Karla hated the way that Jerry treated Sean. Karla's hate for Jerry only intensified when Sean told her that Jerry had come across a picture of Karla with her mother, and then he had deliberately destroyed it. The weekend of June the 11th and 12th, 1983 was very similar to many others in Karla's life. Seemingly endless days of partying where all sense of time and responsibilities were lost due to excessive alcohol and drug taking. Karla's friend Sean was with her, having recently split from her husband Jerry after suffering yet more violence at his hands. This only served to intensify Karla's hate for the man further. At some point in the early hours of Monday the 13th of June 1983, Karla, Danny, together with another one of their friends, James Lebrand, decided to visit Jerry's apartment in Watonga Drive, northeast Houston. They went to the apartment in order to steal some motorcycle parts and to collect money that was owed to Karla. Karla had stolen the keys to Jerry's apartment from Sean, although Sean believed them to be lost. When they arrived at Jerry's apartment, Karla and Danny went straight inside whilst James went looking for Jerry's El Camino. During the burglary, Karla and Danny confronted Jerry in the bedroom, at which point it is believed that Danny struck Jerry multiple times in the head with one of Jerry's hammers. There were several tools left lying around the bedroom that Jerry used in his job as a cable installer. Karla could then hear a gurgling sound coming from Jerry, consistent with fluid building up in his lungs, so, in order to make the noise stop, she repeatedly stabbed him with a pickaxe that she had found in the room. When his body was later found, Jerry had been struck with his pickaxe approximately 28 times. It was widely reported that Karla had bragged that she had received gratification each time that she struck her victim. This was a claim that she later denied. Danny left the room to continue to load stolen motorcycle parts into his truck. At this point, Karla noticed a woman hidden amongst the bedsheets against the wall. The woman, Deborah Thornton, had argued with her husband the day before and then met Jerry at a party and had returned to his apartment with him. A struggle between Karla and Deborah followed, and Danny rushed back in the room to separate them. Karla then repeatedly struck Deborah with the pickaxe, eventually leaving it embedded in her heart. James later testified that during the murders he had walked into the bedroom where he saw Karla pull the pickaxe out of Jerry's body, smile at him, and then plunge it back in. At this point, James left the scene, but later returned to help Danny get rid of Jerry's car. The following morning, Gregory Scott Traver was waiting for Jerry to arrive to give him a lift to work. When Jerry did not show up, Gregory went to his house where he found the mutilated bodies of Jerry and Deborah. Later that evening, details of the double murder were reported on local news channels. Karla and Danny are thought to have sat laughing as they watched these reports, declaring that they would now be famous. After boasting about the murders to Karla's sister, Carrie Ann, and also Danny's brother, Doug. Carrie Ann and Doug went to the nearest police station to report what they had been told. Doug was fitted with a wire and subsequently recorded over 90 minutes of audio where Karla and Danny discussed the details of the murders. 5 weeks after the murder, Karla and Danny were arrested for the killings. James turned state's evidence in return for his freedom. In September 1983, Karla and Danny were formally charged with the murders. It was eventually decided that they would be tried separately, both only for the murder of Jerry, not Deborah. Karla entered a not guilty plea and was placed in jail to await her trial. Within a couple of months of being in jail, Karla started reading a Bible in her cell. She stated that this led to an awakening for her, begging for God's forgiveness. She then became a Christian in October 1983. On April 19th, 1984, after only 70 minutes of deliberation, Karla was found guilty of Jerry's murder. 6 days later, on April 25th, she was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Despite her not guilty plea, after her conviction she never again denied her involvement in the murders. Danny was also found guilty and sentenced to death by lethal injection. During the years of 1984 and 1992, there were many requests for retrials and appeals. All of these requests were denied. During her time in prison, Karla was a model prisoner with a spotless disciplinary record. Due to her conversion to Christianity, many believe that she had been rehabilitated and should never face the death penalty. In 1993, Danny died from liver disease whilst awaiting execution on death row. 2 years later, in 1995, Karla married her prison minister, Dana Brown. As a death row inmate, Karla was not allowed to attend ceremonies and so was married by proxy. As she was not allowed any physical contact with visitors, the relationship was never consummated, not even by a kiss. Karla continued to campaign for her death sentence to be reduced to life imprisonment. She stated that she had completely changed as a person and had truly embraced Christianity. She declared that she was happy to spend her remaining days in prison doing God's work. However, some questioned her motives for this appeal. If the sentence had been reduced to a life sentence, she would be eligible for parole in 2003. She also received a great deal of support with her appeals. The campaign for Karla seemed to turn into a media frenzy, with people such as Pope John Paul II, the United Nations Commissioner, the Italian Prime Minister, and televangelist Pat Robertson all appealing to the state of Texas on her behalf. However, on the 28th of January 1998, the board turned down her appeals. On February the 2nd, 1998, Karla was taken to the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas. She was given her last meal. She requested a banana, a peach, and a garden salad with ranch dressing. Karla selected 4 people to watch her die: her sister Carrie Ann, her husband Dana Brown, her friend Jackie Onken, and Ronald Carson. Ronald was the brother of Karla's second victim, Deborah. He had originally supported the death penalty, but after a religious conversion himself, he subsequently decided that he was opposed to all executions. Also present to witness the execution was Deborah's husband, Richard Thornton, along with her son and stepdaughter. Richard remained in support of the death penalty and believed that the world would be a better place without Karla in it. Despite numerous attempts to stop Karla's execution, her fate was sealed when the then Governor George W. Bush refused to give her a temporary reprieve. Noisy protests by those both for and against capital punishment were held outside the prison. Karla was executed by lethal injection the following day, which was February the 3rd, 1998. She apologised to her victims and their families, and as the chemicals were administered, she started to pray. 8 minutes later, at 6:45 p.m, she was pronounced dead. She was the first woman executed in Texas for 135 years, and only the second to be executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. The first being Margie Velan Barfield, who was executed in November 1984, and whose story I will be covering on the channel soon. Some 45 years earlier, another United States of America woman was spending time on death row, Barbara Graham. She was also known as Bloody Babs, from Oakland in California. She was born on the 26th of June 1923. Barbara's start in life was far from ideal. Her mother was an unmarried sex worker who did not know the identity of her baby's father. When Barbara was just 2, her mother, who was still only a teenager herself, was sent to reform school, leaving Barbara to be raised by neighbours and extended family. Her life became a series of orphanages, foster homes, and convent school. Although intelligent, Barbara received little education and soon fell into a life of trouble, promiscuity, and crime. Just after her 14th birthday, Barbara was sent to Ventura State School for Girls, the same brutal institution where her mother had also been an inmate. In 1939, Barbara was released and tried to make a new start for herself. At the age of just 16, she married Harry Keelhammer, a US Coast Guardsman who was 10 years older than her. She enrolled into a business college and then gave birth to their first son in 1940. She was aged 17 at the time of her first son's birth, and then a second son followed a year later. However, in less than 2 years, Barbara and Harry were divorced, with Harry retaining custody of their children. With this attempt at a more normal life failing, Barbara became a sex worker like her mother before her. During the Second World War, she became a seagull, which is the name given to sex workers who flocked in pairs or groups to nearby naval bases. Despite a couple of further attempts to bring normality to her life, working in a hospital and as a waitress, she always ended up returning to sex work and a life of criminal activity. By the early 1950s, she had worked in bars, brothels, and gambling establishments throughout California and had also built up a substantial criminal record, including arrests for perjury, prostitution, and narcotics possession. At this point, she had cultivated a number of friendships with ex-convicts and career criminals. She was arrested for providing a false alibi for 2 petty criminals and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. After her release, she once again tried a straight life, but soon found the world of waitressing far too dull for her. Yet again she returned to sex work, and in 1953 she married a bartender named Henry Graham. Henry was a drug addict and a hardened criminal. They soon had a son named Tommy. Henry introduced Barbara to many of his criminal friends, including Jack Santo and Emmett Perkins. Barbara soon began an affair with Emmett, an affair that would lead to the downfall of all involved. On March the 8th, 1953, Barbara Graham, her lover Emmett Perkins, Jack Santo, as well as 2 of their criminal associates, John True and Baxter Shorter. They were in high spirits having a dinner meeting at a local drive-in restaurant. The 5 were discussing their latest mark, a 64-year-old widow by the name of Mabel Monahan. Mabel was the ex-mother-in-law of Tutor Shearer, a millionaire Las Vegas gambler. The story circulating within criminal circles was that Mabel often stored money and jewels for her ex-son-in-law, Tutor. Despite Mabel's daughter divorcing Tutor, Mabel had remained good friends. It was rumoured that she stored $100,000 in the safe at her home that could be readily accessed should Tutor ever need it. Mabel still lived in the home that Tutor and his ex-wife Iris had once shared. The spacious house was in a quiet, well-maintained residential neighbourhood in Burbank, which is about 12 miles north of Los Angeles. The gang had devised a plan to gain access to the house and rob Mabel of the money and jewels. The main hurdle in this plan was gaining access to the house, as despite the area's low crime rate, Mabel was anxious of living on her own with only her pet Labrador, Ziggy, and a kitten for company. A hardy row of decorative hedges surrounded the house on 3 sides. A 6-foot-tall concrete wall separated the back garden from the front, and the 2 gardens were separated by a gate that opened onto the driveway. This gate was always kept locked. Mabel installed large floodlights under the eaves of the house that were always switched on when it was dark. There were deadbolts on all of her doors and safety latches on all of the windows. It is unknown where these fears came from. Was it purely a widow in her 60s feeling vulnerable, or something more sinister linked to her ex-son-in-law's high-rolling lifestyle and reputed mob connections? The evening of March the 9th was mild and clear. As dusk turned to night, Mabel let her dog Ziggy out one last time before checking the doors and the windows. She spoke to her friend Merle on the telephone before relaxing for the evening. She was dressed in a blueprint dress with a sweater to keep warm, and Mabel finally settled down in a red leather chair to continue reading The Purple Pony Murders by Sidney T. Porcelain. The previous week, her daughter, Iris Shearer Sauder, had returned to New York following an extended visit with her mother. At some point, breaking the silence of her evening, the doorbell rang. With Mabel's concern for safety and fear of living on her own, it would have presented her with a dilemma as to whether or not to open the door. She made her way slowly to the door. Mabel walked with a limp due to a car accident earlier in her life, which had brought her illustrious roller skating career to an end. The persistent ringing of the doorbell would surely have caused this frail, nervous old lady great anxiety due to the unexpected nature of this visit. When she reached the door, a pretty young woman, who we now know to have been Barbara, told her that her car had broken down and asked if she could use the telephone to call a garage. Barbara appealed to Mabel as a vulnerable young woman and was extremely convincing of her plight to ensure that Mabel opened the door to her. As Mabel slowly unbolted the door, all hell broke loose. Barbara immediately smashed Mabel back into the hallway with a vicious blow to the head. Barbara was followed in by Emmett Perkins, Jack Santo and John True, leaving Baxter Shorter, who was known as the safe cracker, to act as lookout until the others located the safe. It was chaos in the house as the gang tore it apart searching for a safe. Furniture was ripped apart, cupboards upended, wardrobes emptied, contents strewn and smashed everywhere. Eventually, Jack Santo went outside to get Baxter Shorter and told him that there was no safe. By the time Baxter entered the house, Mabel was on the floor in the hallway. There was blood everywhere, and her quiet, pained moans were muffled through a gag. At this point, it is alleged that Barbara was encouraging the gang members to give her more, demanding that Mabel tell them where the money and jewels were hidden. Mabel refused to comply and tell them anything. Eventually, realising that Mabel was not going to say anything, the gang began viciously pistol whipping this frail old lady, dragging her from room to room and trying to make her reveal the location of the safe. When it eventually dawned on the gang that there was no safe, Mabel was suffocated with a pillow. Once the gang realised that their whole plan had fallen apart, they quickly left in the 2 cars in which they had arrived. Baxter Shorter and Jack Santo travelled in one, with the remaining 3 in the other car. Baxter told Jack that he intended to try to get help for the woman at the house, to which Jack replied that he didn't give a damn what Baxter did, as that woman had stopped breathing before they had left. When Baxter dropped Jack off at their meeting place, Jack warned him to keep his mouth shut, or there would be dire consequences. Baxter then called to get an ambulance sent to help Mabel, but in his agitated state, he gave the wrong address, so it never arrived. 2 days later, Mabel's gardener, Mitchell Truesdale, arrived at Mabel's house ready to complete the weekly gardening. Mitchell performed the same routine at each visit. He went to the front door, where Mabel would give him the key for the back gate. When he arrived at the door, he was surprised to find it slightly ajar. He rang the doorbell several times before timidly pushing the door open. He immediately spotted trails of blood on both the floors and the walls. He followed the trail and was horrified to find the battered body of his employer. Mabel was lying face down, half in and half out of a hallway closet. Her Labrador Ziggy was sitting whining by the back door. Mitchell immediately ran to a neighbour's house and called the police. Police Chief Rex Andrews was having lunch when he was informed that there had been a murder. Multiple officers were dispatched to the house, and upon arrival they found bloodstains in nearly every room and the house totally ransacked. Ironically, despite the gang leaving empty-handed, the police investigation revealed that a bag containing around $15,000 in jewels and valuables was in the closet where Mabel's body had been found. The first break in the case came when Baxter Shorter was arrested on another charge and made a deal with the police to turn on the other gang members. He said that he had been horrified to witness the murder and was undoubtedly terrified of being involved in a death penalty case. Details of Baxter's statement were leaked by someone close to the investigation. At that point, Baxter's days were numbered. Shortly after making his statement, Baxter Shorter was kidnapped at gunpoint from his Bunker Hill apartment and has never been seen or heard from since. However, his wife Olivia identified the 2 kidnappers as Emmett Perkins and Jack Santo. On the 3rd of June 1953, Barbara Graham, Emmett Perkins, Jack Santo and John True were indicted by the county grand jury on charges of conspiracy to commit burglary, robbery and murder. At this point, John True decided to turn state's evidence in exchange for his freedom. He was kept under police protection day and night because the prosecution could not afford to lose another witness. Barbara Graham continuously protested her innocence, but damaged her own defence when she offered a fellow inmate $25,000 to hire a friend to provide her with an alibi. The inmate was, however, working with the police to negotiate a deal on their own sentence. Many saw this attempt at bribery as an indication of her guilt. However, Barbara continued to protest that it was an act of desperation. Both Jack Santo and Emmett Perkins also pleaded not guilty. At the trial, journalists focused on Barbara far more than her co-conspirators. Headlines referring to her appearance, makeup, clothes and demeanour were rife, whilst the same level of scrutiny was never applied to the male defendants. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before finding all 3 defendants guilty of the charges brought against them. There was no recommendation for life sentences. Their fates had been sealed. Following the sentencing, the trio returned to prison to await their ultimate punishment. As America's most glamorous death row inmate, journalists were still clamouring for a story about Barbara, whilst Emmett and Jack remained relatively ignored. Photographs were then soon published of Barbara tearfully saying goodbye to her 20-month-old son, Tommy. The narrative of her story began to change from the femme fatale of the trial to this tragic beauty with the horrific upbringing. As this press narrative began to change, more people started to question exactly who was responsible for the death of Mabel Monaghan. Although clearly involved in the crimes of that fateful night, was Barbara actually involved in the violent elements? Questions began to be asked. Could John True's version of events be believed? Had Emmett Perkins and Jack Santo decided to blame Barbara, believing that the state would never execute this beautiful young mother? Did Barbara strike the fatal blow and ultimately suffocate Mabel, or was John True simply trying to protect himself with this version of events? Would male gangsters in the 1950s really have bowed down to a female leader? Every one of the gang individually denied their guilt and blamed the others, but who was actually telling the truth? All of Barbara's appeals remained unsuccessful, and on 2nd of June 1955, Barbara was transferred to San Quentin State Prison. She was scheduled to be executed at 10 a.m. the following morning. When the time came, California Governor Goodwin J. Knight stayed the execution until 10:45 a.m. At 10:43 a.m, Knight once again stayed the execution until 11:30 a.m. Barbara protested, "Why do they torture me? I was ready to go at 10 o'clock. Many saw this treatment as inhumane. Finally, at 11:28 a.m, Barbara was led from her cell and strapped in the gas chamber. She requested a blindfold so that she would not have to look at the people observing. She was advised by the executioner that when the cyanide pellets were dropped, she should take a deep breath to make her death easier, to which she replied, "How the hell would you know?" She then uttered her last words, "Good people are always so sure they're right." Later that day, at the same location, Emmett Perkins and Jack Santo were also executed. 1,180 days after Mabel Monaghan was brutally beaten to death in her own home, Barbara Graham, Jack Santo and Emmett Perkins were executed for their role in that crime. Baxter Shorter had already been killed at the hands of his accomplices, Jack and Emmett. The only other person involved, John True, was released from custody with all charges against him dropped. We will never know exactly what happened in that Burbank house on the night of the 9th of March 1953 and whether those executed were guilty of Mabel's murder or in fact whether a murderer walked free. So that's today's cases covered. I'm just quickly going to show you the old thumbnails that were previously used for the original case. I will also put a link to them in the description as well. Please add any comments down below. If you enjoyed the video, please click like, and if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. Susan Hayward played Barbara in the film I Want to Live. Susan then went on to win the Best Actress Oscar at the 31st Academy Awards in 1959. Goodbye.